open country music, the bottle was never just a vice. For some of its biggest icons, it became a constant companion on tour buses, in recording studios, and sometimes even on stage. While fans heard timeless songs about heartbreak and survival, few realized how rarely sober these legends truly were at their peak. This is not a story of rebellion or romance. This is the quiet, uncomfortable truth behind 12 country icons who were almost never sober. George Jones. At his peak, George Jones did not just sing about heartbreak and regret. He lived inside it. By the early 1960s, his voice was already considered one of the greatest country music had ever produced. But behind that voice was a man whose relationship with alcohol was spiraling fast. What began as casual drinking on the road gradually turned into something far more destructive. Long nights, endless touring, and the pressure to live up to his growing legend pushed Jones toward the bottle as both escape and routine. As the years passed, drinking stopped being occasional. It became constant. Fellow musicians, producers, and promoters noticed that Jones was often intoxicated before shows, during rehearsals, and even inside the recording studio. Sometimes he would arrive drunk. Other times he would not arrive at all. This behavior earned him the infamous nickname No Show Jones, a label that followed him relentlessly and damaged his reputation across Nashville. Promoters lost money, fans were left waiting, and industry trust slowly eroded. Yet, even at his worst, Jones could still sing. That contradiction is what made his story so unsettling. Some of his most emotionally devastating recordings were made during periods when his drinking was completely out of control. Songs like He Stopped Loving Her Today carried such raw pain that listeners assumed it was pure artistry. Few realized how closely that sorrow mirrored his real life, marked by broken relationships, public humiliations, and repeated attempts to regain control. His marriage to Tammy Wynette became another casualty of his alcoholism. Their relationship was passionate but deeply unstable, fueled by arguments, violence, and prolonged drinking binges. Behind closed doors, Jones was increasingly unreliable, emotionally distant, and often unreachable for days at a time. As his personal life collapsed, the industry quietly prepared to move on without him. By the late 1970s, George Jones was still alive, still recording, but no longer trusted. He had become a warning rather than a role model. While some artists self-destructed quickly, Jones endured his downfall slowly, one missed show at a time. Alcohol did not kill him, but it stole years of stability, dignity, and respect. His legend survived, but only after irreversible damage had already been done. Hank Williams was already a legend before most people understood how broken he truly was. By his mid-20s, he had reshaped country music with songs that felt painfully honest, stripped of polish, and filled with sorrow. Yet behind that clarity was a body and mind slowly collapsing. Alcohol was not a side habit in Hank Williams' life. It was woven into his daily existence, blurring the line between survival and self-destruction. Williams suffered from chronic back pain caused by spina bifida, a condition rarely discussed publicly at the time. Doctors prescribed painkillers, but alcohol soon became his most accessible form of relief. What began as a way to dull physical pain quickly evolved into a dependency that affected everything he touched. By the late 1940s, Williams was frequently drunk during rehearsals, radio appearances, and live performances. Friends recalled that it was rare to see him fully sober, even during career-defining moments. His behavior soon became impossible for the industry to ignore. Missed rehearsals, erratic moods, and unreliable appearances followed him wherever he went. In 1952, the Grand Ole Opry expelled Hank Williams for repeated intoxication and failure to show up. For a country artist at the height of fame, this was not just humiliating. It was devastating. Yet even after being banned, Williams continued to record songs that would define the genre for generations. The contradiction was brutal. While his career was unraveling, his songwriting grew darker and more revealing. Tracks like I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry and Your Cheating Heart were not crafted personas. They were confessions. Alcohol amplified his loneliness, his paranoia, and his emotional volatility. Relationships crumbled under the weight of his drinking, and those closest to him struggled to keep him safe. In the final months of his life, Hank Williams was rarely lucid. He traveled while heavily intoxicated, relying on a driver as his health deteriorated rapidly. On January 1st, 1953, he was found dead in the back seat of a car at just 29 years old. Alcohol, combined with prescription drugs, had finally overwhelmed his body. Hank Williams did not fade away. He burned out violently and publicly. His influence remains unmatched, but his story stands as one of the clearest examples of how alcohol quietly consumed a genius long before the world was ready to admit it. Johnny Paycheck. Johnny Paycheck never tried to hide who he was. Unlike other country stars who struggled quietly, Paycheck's battles with alcohol were loud, chaotic, and impossible to separate from his public image. From the beginning of his career, drinking was not an occasional release after shows. It was a constant presence that shaped his temperament, his decisions, and ultimately his downfall. By the early 1970s, Paycheck had tasted real success. Songs like "Take This Job and Shove It" turned him into a working-class hero, someone fans saw as brutally honest and unfiltered. But behind that outlaw image was a man whose drinking was already out of control. Band members and producers later recalled that Johnny was often intoxicated before stepping on stage, sometimes barely able to stand, let alone perform consistently. Alcohol intensified his volatility. When sober, Paycheck could be charming and sharp-witted. When drunk, he became unpredictable and aggressive. Arguments with fellow musicians were common, and confrontations with club owners and promoters became routine. Nashville tolerated him longer than most because his records still sold, but trust eroded quickly. He missed commitments, arrived late to sessions, and alienated people who tried to help him. As the years passed, alcohol began to overlap with deeper trouble. Financial problems mounted, marriages collapsed, and his once bankable image started to look like a liability. The industry, which had briefly embraced his rebellious persona, slowly distanced itself. Unlike carefully managed outlaws, Paycheck felt genuinely dangerous to work with. That perception would follow him for the rest of his career. The turning point came in 1985, when Paycheck shot a man during an argument at his home. While alcohol was not the sole cause, it played a significant role in the reckless mindset that led to the incident. He was convicted and sentenced to prison, effectively ending any remaining mainstream support. During his incarceration, country radio moved on without him. After his release, Johnny Paycheck continued to record and perform, but he was no longer part of the industry's inner circle. Alcohol had stripped him of stability, credibility, and opportunity. He survived his addictions longer than many of his peers, but survival came at a steep cost. His later years were marked by financial struggle and physical decline, far removed from the chart-topping success he once knew. Johnny Paycheck's story is not one of misunderstood rebellion. It is the story of a man whose constant drinking amplified at every flaw until the music industry had no choice but to walk away. Lefty Frizzell. Lefty Frizzell was once seen as the future of country music. In the early 1950s, his smooth phrasing and relaxed vocal delivery reshaped how country songs were sung, influencing generations that followed. But as his influence grew, so did his reliance on alcohol. What began as casual drinking during tours quickly became a permanent fixture in his daily life, quietly undermining a career that should have lasted decades longer. At his commercial peak, Frizzell was rarely fully present. Studio sessions became unpredictable, with producers unsure whether he would arrive focused or already intoxicated. Live performances suffered the same fate. Sometimes he would show up late. Other times, he would appear visibly drunk, slurring words and struggling to maintain control on stage. Promoters tolerated this behavior at first, believing his talent outweighed the inconvenience. Over time, that patience wore thin. Alcohol gradually eroded his discipline. Frizzell missed critical opportunities, failed to promote his own records, and developed a reputation for being unreliable. While younger artists were carefully managed and molded for long-term success, Lefty seemed stuck in a destructive loop. The industry noticed. Radio support weakened, bookings slowed, and his chart presence faded faster than expected for someone of his stature. The tragedy of Lefty Frizzell lies in how preventable his decline appeared. Unlike artists who exploded briefly and vanished, Frizzell had already proven longevity was within reach. Yet alcohol interfered with his health and judgment. Years of heavy drinking contributed to deteriorating physical condition, including liver problems and repeated hospitalizations. Each recovery was followed by another relapse, further shortening the distance between success and obscurity. By the late 1960s, Frizzell was no longer viewed as a leading figure in country music. He was respected, but rarely relied upon. His influence lived on through others, while his own career stalled in the background. Younger singers openly cited him as inspiration, even as he struggled to perform consistently himself. Lefty Frizzell died in 1975 at just 47 years old, after years of declining health linked closely to his drinking. Alcohol did not erase his legacy, but it dramatically limited it. Instead of evolving into a revered elder statesman of country music, he became another cautionary figure, someone whose voice changed the genre, but whose constant intoxication quietly cut his own story short. David Allan Coe. David Allan Coe was never built for Nashville's rules, and alcohol only widened that divide. From the moment he emerged in the early 1970s, Coe presented himself as an outlaw, not just in sound, but in behavior. Drinking was not something he hid between shows. It was part of his public identity, woven into the chaos that surrounded him both on and off the stage. Unlike artists who drank quietly to cope with pressure, Coe's intoxication often happened in plain sight. Fellow musicians recalled shows where he was visibly drunk before stepping in front of a microphone, his mood swinging wildly depending on how much he had consumed. Some nights he delivered powerful, unforgettable performances. Other nights, he was barely coherent. That unpredictability became his trademark and his curse. Alcohol amplified Coe's worst instincts. His confrontational attitude toward the industry hardened, and bridges burned quickly. Nashville executives viewed him as talented but dangerous, someone who could not be controlled or trusted. While the outlaw movement briefly gave him a platform, Coe pushed even those boundaries too far. Drinking lowered any remaining filter, leading to behavior and decisions that made collaboration increasingly difficult. Behind the scenes, alcohol contributed to a deeply unstable personal life. Relationships fractured under the weight of constant touring and erratic conduct. Financial management suffered as well. Royalties were misused, contracts ignored, and long-term planning was almost non-existent. Coe lived moment to moment, and alcohol kept him locked in that cycle. There was little separation between the man performing rebellion and the man being consumed by it. What makes David Allan Coe's story particularly uncomfortable is that his decline was not sudden. It was slow and deliberate. As the industry moved toward cleaner images and more predictable stars, Coe found himself increasingly isolated. Radio support faded. Major opportunities dried up. His reputation as a drunken wildcard followed him into every negotiation, often ending discussions before they began. Yet Coe survived. Unlike many on this list, alcohol did not kill him young. Instead, it cost him relevance. He remained alive, recording and touring sporadically, but permanently outside the center of country music. The man who once embodied outlaw freedom became a figure Nashville preferred to forget. David Allan Coe's story is not about romantic rebellion. It is about how constant intoxication can turn independence into isolation. His voice still echoes in the genre's darker corners, but his career stands as proof that when alcohol becomes an identity, the industry eventually walks away. Waylon Jennings. Waylon Jennings is often remembered as a survivor, but that memory hides how close alcohol came to destroying him long before redemption entered the story. In the early years of his rise, Jennings lived inside a nonstop cycle of touring, recording, and excess. Drinking was not occasional relief after shows. It was a daily presence that blurred boundaries between work, escape, and self-destruction. As the outlaw movement gained momentum in the 1970s, Waylon's reputation grew larger than life. He projected confidence, independence, and defiance, but behind that image was a man rarely sober for long. Alcohol flowed freely on tour buses and backstage, becoming normalized to the point where sobriety felt unnatural. Friends and bandmates later recalled that heavy drinking was simply assumed, not questioned. Alcohol fed his volatility. Arguments with producers, record executives, and collaborators became common. Jennings grew increasingly suspicious of industry control, often interpreting criticism as betrayal. While some of this tension fueled his creative edge, alcohol stripped away restraint. Decisions were made impulsively, relationships damaged unnecessarily, and opportunities quietly lost. Nashville tolerated his behavior longer than most because his records sold, But patience had limits. Physically, the toll was unmistakable. Long nights of drinking left him exhausted and unfocused in the studio. Performances varied wildly in quality, depending on his condition that night. Unlike artists who collapsed suddenly, Jennings declined in waves. Each apparent recovery was followed by another downward spiral. Alcohol did not exist alone in his life, but it formed the foundation that made everything else more dangerous. What separates Waylon Jennings from many others on this list is timing. By the early 1980s, he recognized that constant intoxication was pushing him toward an irreversible end. Health scares, mounting paranoia, and industry pressure forced a reckoning. Unlike others who were cut off or forgotten, Jennings managed to step back before complete collapse. Still, survival came after damage was done. Alcohol cost him years of stability, strained family relationships, and nearly erased his standing as a reliable artist. His legacy today is often framed as triumph over addiction, but that framing ignores how close he came to losing everything. For a long time, Waylon Jennings was not a symbol of control or freedom. He was another country icon, rarely sober at his peak, living on borrowed time without realizing how quickly it was running out. Merle Haggard. Merle Haggard's relationship with alcohol was never as openly chaotic as some of his peers, which is exactly why it proved so dangerous. In the early years of his career, drinking blended seamlessly into his environment. Touring, long studio nights, and the emotional weight of his past made alcohol feel less like a threat and more like a quiet companion. For a long time, few around him questioned it. Haggard rose quickly, carrying the image of a hardened survivor shaped by prison, poverty, and loss. That image gave him credibility, but it also trapped him. Alcohol became a way to manage pressure and expectation, especially as his success accelerated in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He drank regularly, often heavily, but rarely to the point of public collapse. This allowed the behavior to continue unchecked. Behind the scenes, however, alcohol was affecting everything. Studio sessions grew tense. His temper shortened. Band members noticed mood swings that made collaboration difficult. At times, Haggard became emotionally distant, retreating inward rather than outwardly exploding. This made his drinking easier to ignore, but no less destructive. Relationships suffered quietly, eroding trust without the dramatic moments that might have forced intervention. Unlike artists whose careers imploded quickly, Merle Haggard hovered at the edge of self-destruction. Alcohol blurred his judgment and intensified his already complicated personality. Decisions were made impulsively, often driven by frustration or resentment. The pressure to constantly produce meaningful work only added fuel to the cycle. While his songwriting remained sharp, his personal stability did not. What separates Haggard's story from many others is awareness. Over time, he recognized how close he was to repeating the same patterns that had already cost him years of his life before fame. Health concerns, family strain, and creative burnout forced him to confront the reality that alcohol was no longer manageable. Unlike those who denied the problem until the end, Haggard stepped back before the damage became irreversible. Even so, the cost was real. Alcohol stole periods of clarity, strained marriages, and threatened to overshadow the discipline he had fought so hard to build. The industry rarely punished him openly, but it watched carefully. Had his behavior tipped just slightly further, his reputation could have shifted from respected artist to cautionary tale. Merle Haggard survived because he stopped in time. But survival does not erase what came before. For a significant part of his peak years, he lived dangerously close to the edge, sustained by talent while alcohol quietly worked against him. His story stands as proof that not every downfall is loud. Some almost happen in silence. Billy Joe Shaver. Billy Joe Shaver lived his life as if restraint were a foreign concept. From the beginning, alcohol was not something that slowly crept into his career. It was already there, fully formed, shaping his identity as an outlaw long before the industry knew what to do with him. For Shaver, drinking was never hidden behind studio doors. It was loud, public, and inseparable from the chaos that defined his life. As a songwriter, Shaver possessed rare clarity. His lyrics were raw, stripped of sentimentality, and brutally honest. Yet the man behind those words often lived in complete disorder. Alcohol flowed constantly, fueling a lifestyle built on confrontation, impulsive behavior, and self-sabotage. Friends recalled that Billy Joe was frequently drunk for days at a time, moving from barrooms to backstage rooms without pause. Sobriety was the exception, not the rule. Alcohol intensified Shaver's volatility. Arguments escalated quickly. Violence was never far away. His temper, already unpredictable, became explosive when he drank. This reputation followed him everywhere, making him both fascinating and dangerous in the eyes of the industry. Nashville admired his songwriting but hesitated to fully embrace him as a performer. He was simply too unstable to market safely. Personal tragedy compounded the damage. Alcohol did not exist alone in Shaver's life. It intertwined with grief, guilt, and loss, magnifying every emotional wound. Rather than processing pain, he drowned it. Relationships collapsed under the weight of his drinking, and moments of stability were brief and fragile. Even when opportunities appeared, they were often undermined by behavior no one could control. The most disturbing aspect of Billy Joe Shaver's story is how normalized his self-destruction became. Those around him learned to expect chaos. Missed commitments, erratic appearances, and dangerous outbursts were accepted as part of the package. Instead of intervention, there was avoidance. People kept their distance, allowing the cycle to continue unchecked. Shaver survived longer than many expected, but survival came at a cost. Alcohol carved deep scars into his body and mind, leaving him physically weakened and emotionally exhausted. While his songwriting earned him respect, his personal life became a series of warnings rather than lessons learned. He remained alive, but never fully escaped the consequences of decades spent rarely sober. Billy Joe Shaver's story is not one of misunderstood rebellion. It is the portrait of a man who burned through life without breaks, sustained by talent while alcohol steadily erased any chance at peace. His legacy endures in lyrics, but the damage behind them was painfully real. Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson's downfall was quieter than many of his peers, but no less severe. At his height in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Jackson was a respected voice in traditional country music, known for steady performances and a dependable image. From the outside, he appeared disciplined and grounded. Behind the scenes, however, alcohol was steadily dismantling the stability he worked so hard to maintain. Drinking entered Jackson's life gradually, blending into the routines of touring and late-night performances. Unlike the flamboyant outlaws, his intoxication was rarely dramatic. He did not seek chaos. Instead, alcohol became a daily habit, something used to ease nerves, fill empty hours, and cope with the monotony of constant travel. Over time, that habit hardened into dependence. By the mid-1960s, sobriety was no longer his default state. The consequences emerged slowly. Jackson began missing rehearsals and showing up unprepared for performances. When he did appear, he was sometimes visibly impaired, struggling to deliver the consistency audiences expected. Word spread quietly through Nashville that Stonewall Jackson could no longer be fully relied upon. In an industry built on punctuality and trust, that reputation was damaging, even without public scandal. His association with the Grand Ole Opry made the situation especially serious. For a country artist, the Opry was not just a stage. It was validation, protection, and legacy. Jackson's drinking eventually interfered with his commitments there. Repeated issues with attendance and professionalism led to his dismissal from the Opry, a punishment few artists recovered from. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public meltdown, just a silent removal and a door closing. That loss marked a turning point. Without the Opry's support, Jackson's career momentum slowed dramatically. Radio exposure faded, bookings declined, and his name gradually slipped from the center of the genre. Alcohol continued to influence his behavior, making any comeback increasingly difficult. Each missed opportunity reinforced the sense that his best years were behind him. Unlike artists who died young, Stonewall Jackson lived on, carrying the weight of what had been lost. His later years were marked by declining health and limited visibility, far removed from the respect he once commanded. Alcohol did not erase his recordings, but it stripped away the framework that allowed a long, stable career to exist. Stonewall Jackson's story is a reminder that destruction does not always arrive in flames. Sometimes it comes quietly, through habits that seem manageable until the industry, without ceremony, decides to move on. Keith Whitley's voice carried vulnerability in a way few others ever managed. At his peak in the late 1980s, he sounded emotionally exposed, as if every lyric cost him something personal. That sensitivity helped make him a rising star, but it also left him dangerously unprotected. Long before the public recognized his talent, alcohol had already embedded itself into his daily life, quietly shaping his routines and coping mechanisms. Whitley's drinking was not a phase brought on by sudden fame. It began earlier, rooted in insecurity and pressure, and intensified as his career gained momentum. Touring amplified the problem. Nights blurred together, and alcohol became a constant presence, before shows, after shows, and during long stretches of isolation on the road. Those close to him later said it was rare to see Keith fully sober for extended periods, even as his professional success accelerated. Unlike more aggressive personalities, Whitley's intoxication manifested inward. He was not known for explosive outbursts or public chaos. Instead, alcohol deepened his depression, magnified self-doubt, and drained his physical resilience. Studio sessions could be emotionally exhausting. Some days he delivered breathtaking performances. Other days, his focus slipped, and concern quietly spread among those working with him. The unpredictability was subtle, but it was there. As his chart success grew, so did expectations. That pressure became unbearable. Whitley struggled to reconcile the image of a confident country star with the reality of his fragile mental state. Alcohol became the bridge between those two worlds, numbing fear while simultaneously worsening it. Relationships suffered, and attempts at stability often collapsed under the weight of relapse. Even moments of apparent improvement were temporary. What makes Keith Whitley's story especially painful is how close he was to lasting success. His voice was respected, his songwriting admired, and his future seemed secure. Yet alcohol undermined every foundation he tried to build. In 1989, at just 34 years old, Whitley died from alcohol poisoning after days of heavy drinking. There was no dramatic public spiral, no final scandal, just a quiet ending that shocked the industry. After his death, country music reevaluated what it had lost. Whitley was no longer seen as a troubled artist, but as a rare talent whose life ended far too soon. Alcohol did not merely shorten his career, it erased the possibility of growth, evolution, and redemption. His recordings remain powerful, but they now carry an added weight. The sound of someone who was rarely sober and never given enough time to escape the cycle. Keith Whitley did not burn out loudly. He faded inward, consumed by alcohol while standing on the edge of greatness, leaving behind a legacy defined as much by absence as by achievement. Fair and Young. Fair and Young's success arrived early and intensely, and alcohol quickly became part of the machinery that kept him moving. By the late 1950s, Young was one of country music's brightest stars, delivering hit after hit with confidence and precision. Publicly, he appeared sharp, charismatic, and in control. Privately, drinking was already reshaping how he handled pressure, success, and the expectations placed upon him. Unlike artists whose drinking exploded in chaos, Young's dependence developed behind a polished surface. Alcohol accompanied him through long tours, television appearances, and recording sessions, rarely drawing attention at first. He drank to steady nerves, to maintain momentum, and to cope with the growing realization that country music was changing faster than he could adapt. As younger artists emerged and trends shifted, insecurity began to creep in, and alcohol became a familiar refuge. Over time, that refuge turned into a routine. Friends and colleagues noticed that Young increasingly relied on alcohol to get through the day, not just the night. While he remained professional on stage, the emotional cost mounted. Drinking intensified his internal conflict, especially as chart success became harder to sustain. The industry that once celebrated him now expected reinvention, something Young struggled to embrace. As his career slowed, alcohol magnified feelings of isolation. He became increasingly withdrawn, haunted by the sense that his best years were behind him. Attempts to reinvent himself were short-lived, undermined by the same habits that had helped him survive earlier pressure. While he continued to work, the excitement that once surrounded his name faded, replaced by quiet concern among those who knew him well. By the early 1990s, Fair and Young's mental health had deteriorated significantly. Alcohol was no longer simply a coping mechanism. It had become intertwined with depression and a deep sense of disconnection from the industry he once dominated. On December 9th, 1996, Young shot himself, dying 2 days later from his injuries. His death shocked the country music community, forcing a painful reckoning with the toll of long-term emotional decline. Alcohol was not the sole cause of Pharon Young's death, but it played a critical role in weakening his ability to adapt, heal, and seek support. It dulled resilience while amplifying regret. Young's story is not one of sudden collapse, but of slow erosion, a reminder that even artists who appear composed can be quietly unraveling. He survived fame, but not the long shadow it cast. And for much of that journey, alcohol walked beside him, quietly shaping an ending no one wanted to imagine. Townes Van Zandt. Townes Van Zandt was never built for survival inside the music industry, and alcohol ensured that fragility would only deepen. From the earliest days of his career, drinking was not an accessory to success, but a constant companion to his inner turmoil. Unlike stars who drank to celebrate fame, Townes drank to quiet a mind that never stopped collapsing inward. His life was marked early by severe mental health struggles. Hospitalizations, electroconvulsive therapy, and long periods of depression shaped his worldview long before audiences discovered his songs. Alcohol entered as a form of self-medication, blurring emotional pain that he could not otherwise escape. By the time his songwriting gained recognition, heavy drinking was already routine. Sobriety was rare, and stability even rarer. On stage, Townes could appear hauntingly focused, delivering performances that felt intimate and devastating. Offstage, alcohol consumed nearly everything. Friends recalled long stretches where he drank constantly, drifting between couches, cheap hotels, and temporary shelters. Unlike other artists, he had little interest in protecting a career or cultivating reliability. Alcohol dissolved any remaining structure, leaving him disconnected from industry expectations and personal responsibility. Despite his brilliance, Nashville never knew what to do with him. He was admired, even revered by fellow songwriters, but impossible to market. Alcohol amplified that distance. Missed opportunities, ignored contracts, and abandoned projects became common. When moments of clarity emerged, they were brief and often followed by deeper decline. The industry watched from a distance, unsure whether intervention was possible or even welcome. What makes Townes Van Zandt's story especially painful is that he seemed aware of his own trajectory. His lyrics often hinted at self-destruction, isolation, and the inevitability of loss. Alcohol did not blind him to those truths. It merely made living with them tolerable, at least temporarily. Friends described cycles of sobriety followed by relentless relapse, each return to drinking more damaging than the last. Townes died on January 1st, 1997, at the age of 52. Years of alcohol abuse had weakened his body beyond recovery. There was no dramatic final scandal, no public collapse, just a quiet ending that mirrored much of his life. While alcohol was not the only force at work, it was the constant thread tying together his physical decline and emotional exhaustion. Townes Van Zandt did not chase longevity or legacy. He chased relief. Alcohol offered it briefly, then demanded everything in return. His songs endure because they speak to suffering with rare honesty. But behind that honesty was a man who spent most of his life rarely sober, slowly disappearing while still breathing.